think that painting always has this paradox of making eternal something totally temporary. To me, that's a kind of rare thing in the world, besides maybe photography. There are so many things in the world now that are made through a process of laborious editing, or things that are made by committee in some kind of way. And I think that painting has this very special ability to freeze one feeling and one very discrete amount of time forever. And I think because it's in contrast to all of these other things, I think that's totally important. I mean, I grew up in Vermont, so I think it's kind of hard to not be in love with the natural world. And I thought I wanted to be a wildlife biologist when I was a kid for this reason. And I think there's something bizarrely related between animals and paintings, in that they're this living thing that is sort of mysterious and it's almost human, but no matter what you do, you can't completely understand it. I also think, nature, in a very different way than painting, nature is expression. It's expression of the world's like Schopenhauerian will to power. And I think in a way that will to life or will to power is very similar to what one is trying to capture, making a figurative painting, making a face, making a body. So I think there's something vital, something about living energy that is the reason that I began in wildlife biology and ended up becoming a painter. I mean, when I was very, very little, I don't remember it, but apparently when I was 3 or maybe even 2, I started drawing, and I apparently started just drawing faces, like a little circle and 2 eyes and a nose and a mouth, very obsessively, and covered our whole house with them. My parents have photos of our cat with Post-it notes on the cat, covered in these smiley faces. And I think back to that, and I think that was just this very primitive, early encounter with the magic of making another being and then being with that other being. And yeah, that's a very magical thing. So I think that's still deep within me, and it relates to how I draw now, bizarrely. But then as a young person going through school, I really didn't think that someone like me could become an artist. And I think it's because I was kind of shy, but also just kind of horribly perfectionistic, to the point where I was like afraid to speak in class and would blush really badly when I would get called on. And yeah, I just imagined that to be an artist, one had to be almost animalistically intense and spontaneous, and I didn't think I had that. And then I guess as I got older, I started to believe that that contradiction within me of both having big emotions and intense things to express, but also being a little bit restrained or wanting to have a certain amount of control. Those two things in opposition, I realized I could put all of that into my work, and that the contradiction would be more interesting than if I was just completely unbridled and splashing paint around. So I think from the beginning my work has been about the reconciliation of those two things, which I'm not saying anything new. That's the Apollonian and the Dionysian. It's the eternal contradiction in art. And now that I'm older, I think I realize that basically all art has this contradiction. No one is pure impulse. There's always intensity and then discretion. They're always in opposition. Well, I could say one more thing about art history. Mm-hmm. In the last year or so, I was reading Joyce, I was reading Ulysses, and at some point I felt like I needed to understand the ancient world that Joyce is writing in response to. And so I finally got around to reading Homer. And then through Homer, I became kind of obsessed with archaic Greek sculpture. I think that there are these amazing things that happen in Ulysses where the ancient world is woven like a tapestry into the modern world, and the text kind of refracts back and forth. And this is something I've always been fascinated by. Things in the modern world that have an ancient resonance, or things in the ancient world that still feel relatable. So I've been looking at these archaic Greek sculptures and finding these gestures, whether it's a woman with her hands on her chest or her head in an act of mourning. I think that still completely relates to gestures that we make today. Or whether it's a depiction of a mother and child, which exists, 2000 BC in Egypt, but is something you could also see walking down the street. And I've always found this simultaneous resonance totally fascinating. Another example of this is there are these amazing paintings depicting the biblical story of St. Paul, who survived in the desert because this raven or crow would bring him bread. And this is how he survived for a very long time. And so there are these beautiful, beautiful paintings where there's a raven flying through the sky with bread in its mouth coming to St. Paul. And the very amazing thing about that to me is that you're walking around the world and you see ravens everywhere with a piece of bread in their mouth. And it only adds to the poignancy of this biblical scene that it has a modern resonance or a universal resonance. So when I look at art history, I'm basically trying to pull forth themes that mean as much now as they did at some other time in history. think it's totally fascinating that if you go all the way back to the very beginning of art history, like the Palaeolithic and the Neolithic, there are female figurines. That's like the first artwork that we have. And it's also totally fascinating that we don't fully understand what these things were. You could call them, and people do call them, fertility goddesses, fertility sculptures, this kind of thing. But we really don't know because there's no written record. But we do know that for most of human history, we've made female figures. There are very few early male figures from those times. So when I make a figure in my work, I feel like I have this chance in my own small way to connect with this amazing entire history of art. And yeah, there's the Paleolithic, and then there's Egyptian art, ancient Greece, the Madonna and Child, all the way up through Matisse and Picasso. The female figure has always had this special central place in art, even as her meaning shifts based on context. So I feel like I'm connecting with that entire history when I use the female figure as my subject. I had a really great professor in undergrad who would say that art history is not linear. It leaves gaps, and you can just jump back into a gap. You can close a loop. You can make connections across millennia. Someone said to me the other day, art history is written in pencil, not in pen. So I think, yeah, for most of human history, most of the depictions that we have of women have been created by men. And so there is this kind of external voyeuristic take on the figure that is totally interesting. But I do feel like I'm able to contribute something somewhat different in that I think I have an empathetic connection to the female figure. You don't have to include this, but there is this really amazing and bizarre Picasso quote where he talks about desire, and he somehow, in this very strange circular logic, says that the best artists should be lesbians, and that he himself is a lesbian artist because he is somewhat both a woman and both relating to and desiring his female subject. And despite the strangeness of this logic, I do think that there is something interesting about both desiring and feeling akin to the figure that you're depicting. I think pure voyeurism isn't interesting. So I think that even though so much of the history of art has been men painting women, the very best painting, like whether it's Raphael or Matisse, has a sort of tenderness and an empathy to it. And I think as a female artist depicting women, I'm able to have a more direct empathy for my subjects. I don't think I'm painting from the kind of voyeuristic desire of a man painting a woman in some kind of old-timey way, but I do think that desire is involved in what I'm doing. Painting is fictional, it's two-dimensional, and these bodies anatomically couldn't exist and they don't need to exist, and I think there's a beautiful freedom in that. And I think desire is involved when I make a perfect, massive curve of a shoulder down to a waist, down to a hip. And it's more, I'm able to imagine a figure that's more perfect than any figure could ever be, in my mind. And I think that that kind of freedom of imagination is something that propels the work. Right now I'm really interested in the single figure because I've been looking at Palaeolithic, Neolithic art and archaic Greek sculpture, and I think there is something interesting there to this one self-contained consciousness, which we try to have access to when we look at a painting or a sculpture, but always remains a little mysterious. So for a while, I've been really preoccupied with what happens with a single figure on the canvas. I think it's kind of incredible whether you look at late Picasso or at emojis or at, like, Wittgenstein himself drew tiny drawings that are just a little circle and two eyes and a funny little mouth. And in all those cases, it's sort of amazing how loose the forms can get and still register as a face and still enact a mood. So I'm always trying to push myself with the vocabulary of faces to see how strange and far things can get from reality, but still have an empathy or convey an emotion. Yeah, I mean, it's very strange. You would think that on a larger canvas, the figure might be smaller, there might be more space around it, and that the opposite would be true on a small piece of paper. But somehow, the interaction between the figure and the edge is always this fascinating tension to me, and I think it goes to the core of how I see painting in general, which is as a metaphor for what it is to be a person and to try to fit into a certain shape or come to terms with a rigid world, this kind of thing. So I'm always interested in how this unruly, loose, rounded figure interacts with the rectangle, no matter what scale I'm working on. I don't have any academic background in color theory or anything like this. So from the very beginning of my time painting, I've always approached color intuitively. So in the beginning, I got a lot of mileage out of trying to put colors side by side that were completely wrong. So, you know, bright pink next to bright orange. think putting colors together like that just emphasizes the physical object of the painting. And I've always kind of liked painting that felt like sculpture, that had this kind of bodily presence. And so even though the paintings are more pared back now, I'm basically thinking of them as having bodily presence, and that's how I approach color. So right now I'm gravitating toward lots of pinks and reds for that reason. I've also pulled back the palette in order to feel more like I'm drawing in painting. Like a drawing is usually one colored line on a white sheet of paper, and so now in the paintings I'm taking that same impulse into paint with a white ground and usually a red or a yellow or a black line. And this very reduced vocabulary is letting me basically paint in the same way that I draw. I think there are many mediums available to someone who wants to make a political point. Writing, journalism, photography. And I don't think that painting is the best vehicle for ideology. So when the world is crazy and tragic things are happening everywhere, I think we should be writing about that, informing ourselves about the facts. But I think that painting has this unique position where its subject is mood and humanity and empathy, and I think that can have some kind of healing power that is not literally dealing with our politics, but it does relate, if only by analogy. I think that painting always has this paradox of making eternal something totally temporary. And to me, that's a kind of rare thing in the world, besides maybe photography. There are so many things in the world now that are made through a process of laborious editing, or things that are made by committee in some kind of way. And I think that painting has this very special ability to freeze one feeling and one very discrete amount of time forever. And I think because it's in contrast to all of these other things, I think that's totally important.